Let's talk about your metabolism and how you can fix your metabolism. I always hear people talking about their metabolism, and their metabolism is the reason why either they're fat or they're very skinny. If people are very skinny, then the reason is because they have a very fast metabolism. And at the same time, if people are too fat and they can never lose weight, it's because their metabolism is way too slow. Now, what exactly is your metabolism? Well, your metabolism isn't this magic that happens in your body that determines how fast you can lose fat. Your metabolism is actually all the reactions that are going on in your body. And you can really break down these metabolic reactions into two different types of reactions. You either have anabolic reactions or catabolic reactions. So anabolic reactions or anabolism is basically when we're in need of storage. So this is when we take building blocks like monosaccharides or amino acids, and we build them up into bigger things like carbohydrates or proteins. Now, at the same time, you have catabolism. Now, catabolism is basically when you're in need of energy, and that's when you take these bigger compounds and you break them up into smaller molecules that can be used for energy. So one thing I always hear from people who are trying to lose weight is it's all about calories in versus calories out, right? Because if you are burning this amount of calories in a day and you start consuming calories that are less than that, then naturally you should lose weight, right? It should be as simple as that, where if you are consuming less calories than you're burning, then you have to lose weight. The only problem is our bodies are a little more complex than this. And the reason our bodies are more complex than this is because of our hormones. So one hormone in particular I want to talk about is insulin. So insulin is one of the hormones that's going to determine whether or not you're going to be either burning fat or putting on more fat. So basically, if your insulin spikes and your insulin is up, this is when you're going to be storing more fat. And if your insulin is down, then this is when you're going to be burning fat. So if your insulin is too high, this is what's going to mimic a slower metabolism. And this also enhances the storage of new fat. So the biggest thing here that I'm going to focus on is controlling your insulin levels. So let's talk about what happens when your insulin goes up. So here's some symptoms that you get when you have high insulin for a long period of time. So one is you're going to be more hungry. Specifically, you're going to be craving carbohydrates. Another symptom of high insulin is frequent urination. You're also going to be more fatigued. Also, as we said before, higher insulin means you're going to be storing more fat. So you're going to start to see more fat build up. And another thing that happens is you have this set point. So if you're ever trying to lose weight and you're stuck at this certain weight and you can't get below that weight, that's what's called your set point. And having a higher insulin will make that set point higher. So your insulin is actually behind this inability to lose weight. And also what happens is when you have high insulin for a long period of time, you have what's called insulin resistance. So just like anything else, let's say you are an alcoholic or you are a chain smoker, over time you start building up a tolerance to that, right? Like at first it would probably take you a few drinks to get drunk, and then if you do it for a long period of time, it'll take more and more to get that same level of buzz. Now it's the same thing with insulin in our body. So if we have high insulin for this long period of time, we're going to start developing this insulin resistance, where our receptors just don't respond to insulin as well. So what insulin does is it has to basically produce more insulin to make up for that insulin resistance. So even if we're not eating more sugar, our insulin will start to create more sugars in our body. And it does that with something called gluconeogenesis. So basically what it does is your liver will start to produce more sugar from things like fat and protein in our body. And that will rise our blood sugar more and in turn increase our insulin even more. And this will help fight off that insulin resistance that we're getting. Now, I want to make one point clear here. So we're talking a lot about insulin, and it's making it seem like we want to get rid of insulin completely, when that's really not the case. Our body actually needs insulin because without it, we wouldn't be able to store the sugars that we eat. And actually without it, we would be a type 1 diabetic. Type 1 diabetes is someone whose pancreas cannot produce any insulin. So we need insulin. I don't want you to get the wrong idea here. But the trick is to control your insulin. So we don't want our insulin to be too high for too long of a period of time. Now, let's take a back step for a second. What exactly are the functions of insulin? So as we said before, insulin's main function is to store sugar. right? But it also regulates our metabolism. Our insulin regulates a lot of the metabolic processes that go on in our body. So normally when we eat, our blood sugar will rise and our insulin will start working to control that blood sugar, and they'll start bringing that blood sugar down, and this will take like 2 to 3 hours. And once it's done storing all that blood sugar, then our blood sugar levels should be normal again. Now, how is this different in someone that has diabetes? Well, in diabetes, our insulin will start working, and again, this is a type 2 diabetic, not a type 1 diabetic. Our insulin will start working to bring that blood sugar down, but it'll take a lot longer and it'll work a lot slower than it would for a regular person. So it takes a long time for this blood sugar now to come back to what's considered normal. And over time, what happens and what the reason someone becomes a diabetic is, like I said before, they have this insulin resistance, where their insulin is too high for a long period of time, and that blood sugar level never gets back to normal before we have another spike in our food. Now, it's not just sugar that increases our insulin, it's also other foods. Basically, anytime we eat, we're gonna have at least a little bit of an insulin response. And one reason for that is because we have these hormones in our gastrointestinal system that every time we eat, it naturally just releases more insulin. But also, proteins can increase our insulin as well. So it's not just sugar that increases our insulin. And specifically, if you have protein without eating any fat, that's going to increase your insulin the fastest. Now, obviously, eating sugar will increase your insulin faster, but a lot of people don't take this into account. Our protein also increases our insulin. Now, this is all part of what's called the insulin index. So you probably heard of the glycemic index. Now, the glycemic index is basically when you eat something, what certain foods will start to increase your blood sugar the fastest. Now, this is going to be different than our insulin index. Our insulin index is the same thing as the glycemic index, but instead of measuring your blood sugar, it's measuring your insulin spike. So for example, let's look at eggs. So if you eat just an egg white, this is a very popular opinion now, that if you try to avoid cholesterol and you try to avoid the egg yolk, that this is going to be healthier because now you're just eating the protein. Well, the problem is that just the egg white will increase your insulin a lot more than the egg yolk. Now keep in mind there's no sugar in here, so it's not going to increase your blood sugar levels. Your blood sugar levels are going to stay the same, but your insulin levels will rise with just eating an egg white. Now let's compare to just eating an egg yolk. Well, if you just eat an egg yolk, your insulin's still going to go up, but not nearly as much. Now, if we take that and we combine the whole egg, if we take the egg yolk and we take the egg white and we eat the whole thing, well, our insulin is still not going to spike that much. It will spike a little bit more than just eating the egg yolk, but it will not spike nearly as much as eating just the egg white. Now you see the problem here, right? Because if you want to fix your metabolism and you want to start burning more fat and you want to get a faster metabolism, then you have to control your insulin. But if you're just eating these egg whites and having this so-called healthier diet, well, now you're triggering an insulin response. And we already saw what happens when you have a higher insulin level for too long of a time. And this is what I think is one of the biggest lies we were told for so long. The notion that things that are low in fat are actually healthier than normal foods has been one of the biggest lies we were all told. Have you ever heard of the saying that if it isn't broke, don't fix it? Well, that's exactly what we did when we started coming up with these weird diets. Now, going off of this insulin index, if you look at something like butter, butter is one of the things that will increase your insulin the lowest. It will barely spike your insulin at all. And if you add this to your foods, or if you add other fats to your proteins, then your insulin spike is going to be a lot lower. But the problem with a lot of diets nowadays is they're high in protein and they're low in fat. And they think that this is healthier because we want to get rid of fats. But fats aren't the problem here. The problem is that we're not controlling our insulin levels. We're not controlling the hormones in our body, and that's going to throw off our metabolism. Fat is actually a buffer. And this buffer is what helps control our insulin levels. So our body needs this fat. So it's your guys' lucky day. I'm gonna bring out the whiteboard again. So let's talk about what exactly triggers your insulin. So obviously we talked about carbohydrates, right? Sugars and other carbohydrates, those will for sure trigger our insulin and spike our insulin the highest amount. Another thing is snacking. So if we are having, let's say, 3 meals a day, we're having breakfast, lunch, and dinner, but we're not snacking at all in between them, then our insulin levels should be relatively normal, right? Because you eat breakfast and then you have 2 to 3 hours for that blood sugar to come down or insulin levels to come down, and then we eat lunch, and then the same thing happens again, and then we have dinner. So that lack of snacking in between them will not trigger our insulin. But instead, in between them, we're gonna start snacking on other things, like we're gonna start snacking on chips or popcorn or whatever we like to eat. Well, the problem with that is it's never gonna give us time for that insulin to come down and our blood sugar levels to correct. Now, instead, our insulin levels are gonna stay high throughout the day, and we're gonna have, over time, this chronically high insulin. And you probably guessed what can happen after that is over time, we can get this insulin resistance. And over time with this insulin resistance, our body will not react to insulin as well. And this is one of the things that can contribute to diabetes. Now, we already talked about protein. Protein without having any sort of fat with it will also spike our insulin. Another thing I want to talk about is stress. So if we have a stress response in our body, it's called our sympathetic nervous system or our fight or flight mode. It releases a hormone called cortisol. Well, if our cortisol levels are too high, it can actually affect our blood sugars. Over time, if we have high cortisol levels in our body, this can start turning the proteins in our body into glucose. And this alone can start affecting our insulin levels and throw off our blood sugars. Now, there are a lot of different things that stress can do to our body, and constantly having this high cortisol levels can do a lot more than just affecting our insulin levels. So if you want to know ways you can reduce your stress levels, reduce your anxiety levels, I actually put a link in the description below where you can check out another video I made on that. Okay, so now let's talk about what can actually start to lower our insulin. So the first and the biggest thing is going to be lower your carbs. Lower the amount of carbs in your diet, and that will already start to lower the insulin levels in your body a lot. If you're not doing this, if you're not lowering the carbs, if you're not lowering the snacking, the amount of sugary foods that you're eating, or just carbohydrates in general, then your insulin levels will never start to go down. So this is gonna be the biggest thing. I wanna stress that. Now, another thing that can start to lower our insulin levels is fasting. So one popular thing is intermittent fasting. So basically the goal here is to give your insulin time to recover, right? And this is exactly why snacking is so bad for you, because you're never letting that insulin recover. You're constantly introducing new food to your body, and that's constantly keeping your insulin levels at a higher level. So instead, if you try this fasting, like let's say instead of eating breakfast, you just eat lunch and dinner. So actually, this is what I do on a daily basis. I don't eat breakfast. So instead, I just have 2 meals a day. I have 1 meal for lunch and 1 meal for dinner. After that, I don't eat for quite a bit of time. So basically, the times that I'm eating are 1 p.m. and then I have another meal at, let's say, 6:30 p.m. After that, I don't eat again until the next day. So this is giving that insulin time to come down. It's giving your blood sugars time to come down, and it's giving your body time to recover. Now, also, you don't want to be sedentary, right? You can't just be sitting around and expect your insulin levels to go down. You can't expect your metabolism to get fixed. So you need to do some exercise. Now, specifically, you need to do something that is high intensity, and also you can try resistance training. So there is a lot of research out there showing, for example, resistance training is one of the best ways to increase your metabolism and to control your insulin levels. Now, also, you want to do something that is high in intensity. It's better to do something that is very high intensity for a shorter period of time than to keep a long workout, like a 2-hour workout, that isn't as high intensity. And there's actually a study that is backing this up. So basically, they were testing 3 groups. So one group was a control. So that group doesn't really matter. There was another group that was doing moderate exercising for 60 minutes. And there was a third group that was doing very high intensity workout for 30 minutes. So they actually tested this for about 13 weeks. And what they found is the group that exercised at a higher intensity for a shorter period of time compared to the group that did like moderate intensity for a longer period of time, they burned the same amount of fat. but also the group that did a higher intensity burned more calories. But one important thing here is the group that worked out at a higher intensity only worked out half the amount of time. Now, what does that do? Well, one thing is you save a lot of time. You don't have to spend as much time in the gym, but also you don't increase as much inflammation in your body, because anytime you work out, you increase inflammation in your body, and that's going to make it harder, one, for your body to recover, but also if you have higher inflammation, it's going to also throw off your insulin levels and give you a higher spike in insulin. And actually, there's another cool thing you can do, and it can actually control the cortisol release you get after a workout. So if you do a very intense workout for a long period of time, and you want to find a way to recover after that can reduce that cortisol and you can let your body heal a lot faster, I'm going to put a link to that video in the description below where I go over that. So make sure you check that out as well. Now, also, you need to start adding more fiber to your diet. Specifically, you can get fiber from vegetables and fruits. Fiber is one of the things that does not increase your insulin at all. So if we start adding fiber to our diet, that can help control and keep our insulin levels lower. Now, this is one of the reasons why eating fruits is so much better than eating other foods that have added sugars in them. Because our fruits have a lot of fiber in them, they have a lot of nutrients in them, and they won't trigger as much of an insulin response. Also, our body needs to have good sleep. We need to have good quality sleep if we're gonna start recovering and start to have a faster metabolism. Now, if you wanna learn more about sleep and ways you can get better sleep, better quality sleep, and get more sleep, and learn more about the importance of good sleep, I'm putting another video in the description below, so make sure you check that out. Now, this one's gonna be interesting, apple cider vinegar. But basically, there was a study that involved 3 groups. They had one group that was a placebo, they had one group that was taking 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar a day, and another group that was taking 2 tablespoons of apple cider vinegar a day. And they studied them for a course of 12 weeks. What they found is the people that had 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar a day lost about 2.7 pounds. And the group that had 2 tablespoons a day lost about 3.7 pounds. And also the group that had 1 tablespoon lost about 0.7% of their body fat, and the group that had 2 tablespoons a day lost about 0.9% of their body fat after just 12 weeks. Now, why is that? Why is that the case that just adding 1 tablespoon of apple cider vinegar a day to your diet, or 2 tablespoons of this, can start to increase your fat loss? So basically, apple cider vinegar will affect a molecule in our body called AMPK. So AMPK is basically an energy sensor. So basically, if you aren't eating and you have this AMPK in your body, it'll start triggering fat burning. And the reason is because it wants to start getting new energy. Now, the problem with this is it's the exact opposite when AMPK levels are in your brain. Because if your AMPK levels in your brain are elevated, then it'll tell your body that it's starving, and it'll tell your brain that you need to start eating more food, so you'll start craving more food and you'll get more hungry. So the goal here is to have high AMPK levels in your body where it can start burning that fat, but low AMPK levels in your brain so you don't think you're hungry all the time. Now, for some reason, this apple cider vinegar does exactly that. It elevates the AMPK in our body, but it doesn't elevate the AMPK levels in our brain. Now, the last thing I wanted to talk about is dieting with breaks. Now, this is kind of similar to what I was talking about before with the intermittent fasting, but I just want to stress the importance of this. So there was a study that was involving 2 different groups that were going to go on this diet for 16 weeks. Now, one group was dieting continuously that whole time. So they figured out how many calories they burn in a day, and they fed them about 67% of those calories, so a calorie deficit for those 16 weeks. Now, the other group was doing sort of a 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off approach. So for 2 weeks, they were dieting, then 2 weeks, they were going back to their normal life, then 2 weeks they were dieting, and it went back and forth like that. Now, the total length of their diet for both of these groups was 16 weeks. Now, what's really interesting here is that both groups did lose weight and they both lost fat. But the group that was dieting the whole time only lost about 9.1 kilograms, as opposed to the other group that was taking these breaks, they lost about 14.1 kilograms. Not only that, the second group lost more fat and they were more likely to keep this fat and this weight off. Now, why is that? Well, I'm not sure exactly why, but I'm sure it has something to do with this fasting and this controlling of our insulin level. So if you guys are trying to speed up your metabolism and you guys are trying to fix a broken metabolism, then this is the way how to do it. If you follow these steps, you will start to fix your metabolism. Thank you guys for watching. I hope you liked that video. If you haven't already, hit the thumbs up button and subscribe to my channel below. I will see you in the next video.